Time for another stop off in the final frontier. Continuing to work my way through commissioned reviews, and I have another pair of Star Trek The Next Generation episodes. These ones slightly less directly thematically linked than some of the others I've been commissioned to do as pairs, but they're still both interesting to talk about, certainly. This time I'm going to be talking about the Season 5 episode Outcast and the Season 6 episode Quality of Life. Let's actually start with quality of life, because I have a feeling I'm going to have a lot more to say about Outcast. So quality of life is an episode that has the Enterprise going to this sort of satellite station thing that is engaged in a new mining technique. The details don't really matter, but it has on board, in addition to all the technology that they're trying to get up and running and fully functioning, and part of the reason the Enterprise is there is to assess whether or not this is worth even continuing to do. Part of what is keeping everything up and running are these little robots called exocoms. It's a silly kind of name, and it's a silly looking little machine that is sent in to do work that a human couldn't do safely, and does it better, faster, makes its own tools with a little mini replicator, and they're incredibly helpful. And Data has a suspicion that they may have developed an intelligence to the degree that they should be qualified as life, and should be regarded as such, and not used the way they're currently being used. So there's a lot of things that are interesting about this one, and it's the kind of thing that the more I think about it, the more I'm like, I'm surprised that Star Trek hasn't, at least to my knowledge, delved further into this idea more often, because we have Data. And like, the episode actually does a good job of distinguishing Data from the exocoms, in that Data was designed with the intention of being an artificial form of life. That was his initial purpose. That's why Dr. Soong created him, was trying to accomplish that. So even though within Star Trek we've had the whole debate, is Data a person or is he property? And I've talked about that episode and a related one already, and another one of these double bills. Here, we're dealing with something that was never intended to become self-aware, to become sentient, to attain the level of intelligence where you can't just send it off to do whatever you want it to do, like it has no thoughts of its own. And it's kind of interesting to see that distinction and watch what happens, because with just the degree of technology going on, you do have to kind of wonder, has this not happened before? And the funny thing is, the episode kind of covers for that maybe it has happened before. Because when one of the exocoms doesn't properly follow a command, the woman who created these things, she basically classifies it as a bug. It's like, every now and then they need a reset and then they follow commands again. Basically, she had clocked their intelligent self-awareness as a fault, wiped them, started over, and then it was just a matter of time before the intelligence built up again to where it hit that same bug, where if they were, the sort of catalyst here is sent into a situation where it could get the job done, but it also would have been destroyed, and neglecting its orders for the sake of self-preservation. We find out from the way she talks about it that she's encountered this kind of bug before. So that was really interesting. Watching things go back and forth and the way they sort of go about testing this and trying to figure this out, and Data listening to his, for lack of a better term, instincts and really following through, but also not going solely on those instincts, like finding the things to back him up. And even though he moves farther forward with maybe only a small amount of evidence than other people might, because he has a personal investment in this, I think they still balance that really well, where for a machine that does not have emotions, he is still his version of passionate about this. And that, I think, works really, really well. And it's interesting watching how some of those around him are more prepared to accept this as at least a possibility than others are. The woman who created these things disregards it completely because part of her is going to be thinking, I need these tools. I need them to do what I say. You recognize them as living things, and suddenly I'm not allowed to do that anymore. She's looking at it very pragmatically, whereas with everything that they've experienced up to this point, other members of the crew are thinking about it like, well, maybe this is, or at the very least, we need to consider this. So they do a good job catching the spectrum of it. And I feel like the positions are a bit more understandable, certainly than they were in The Offspring when I covered that one. So there are a couple of weird hiccups narratively. I think thematically and philosophically, this is actually pretty sound. It doesn't delve super into the ideas of what qualifies as life. That's not really where it's going at. It's more just sort of tinkering with the idea of something that wasn't anything we ever accounted for becoming that level of intelligent, becoming that, and trying to deal with the ramifications of that. It doesn't get as much into the philosophical weeds as Measure of Man did. But since Measure of Man already exists, it doesn't really have to. But just structurally and narratively, there's one thing that it does that's weird to me, and another thing that it does that is just, unfortunately, narratively cheap. They kind of chickened out a bit. So the first thing that's a little bit weird is when they realize that what the exocom did was appear to disobey an order for the sake of self-preservation, they then immediately say, okay, well, let's recreate the circumstances under which it did that, see if it does it again. Now, granted, they're doing it as a simulation and not actually putting the thing in danger, but it annoys me that nobody, not Data or anybody else, at least floated the notion that, okay, but if this is an intelligent thing, we are about to induce massive psychological trauma that could probably be considered torture if this thing isn't consenting to what we're about to put it through. And maybe that was just a level further than they were prepared to consider, but like I had that thought immediately. I'm like, okay, it behaved a certain way because it thought it was going to die. And you're just going to shove it in that situation again, that as far as it knows, it's in the exact same situation again. Like that feels cruel. And I'm not saying they shouldn't have done it. I think as far as how the plot progresses, it makes sense and it works. But like, I kind of wish at least one person has said, if these things are alive and intelligent, that's actually kind of screwed up what we're about to do. And like, if it then gets shot down as a matter of well, you know, it's our best option, we have limited time, etc., like, fine, but just, I wish somebody had acknowledged that. And then the thing that's kind of a cheap cop-out is the circumstances that happen at the end. That basically circumstance and situations happen that allow it to be made clear that these things are alive and that also they are going to help and put themselves in danger and save the situation. So like, it covers all the bases. It's one of those things where it's not quite a Deus Ex Machina because it is all stuff that's set up, but it is manipulating the story to have circumstances that will allow for the cleanest outcome. The debate is now over. Whereas I think it would have been a lot more interesting to leave it as a lingering question where, you know, maybe there's enough people to overrule this woman who made the stuff, made the exocoms or what have you, but like there's still a question. Or if it is made clear they are definitely alive, but they aren't willing to help. And so rather than do their job when asked, are you willing to do this? And they say yes, because that's what will resolve the logistical plot problem of we have this station that's actually needing repair or is going to break down. But what if they were asked, are you willing to endanger yourselves to help do this? The thing that we were going to try and force you to do before, we're now asking if you're up for. What if they'd said no? I think that would have been a lot more interesting, a lot denser, a lot more thoughtful opportunity to really examine that. then, oh, well, thank goodness they actually wanted to do the things that we were going to force them to do anyway. Whew! Well, that really morally simplifies this situation, doesn't it? It's the easy way out, and it kind of annoyed me for that reason. Oh, one other weird random thing. I kind of love the cold open on this because it has this whole thing with the poker game, because at this point Geordi has grown a beard, and so it's Geordi, Worf, and Riker playing poker with Beverly Crusher, and she has this little thing about how beards are an affectation. It's the male equivalent of putting on makeup, and I kind of love that interaction and conversation. So, having now dealt with that one, let's deal with the one I actually watched first, which is The Outcast. Now, The Outcast is an episode that I know by reputation because my friend Jessie Gender has talked about it a few times. She did a video focusing directly on it right there, which I'm linking to that, but I actually haven't watched that one. I know it because she's referenced it elsewhere in other stuff of hers I have seen. Because, even as I become friends with other YouTubers, I don't really have the time to go back through their entire back catalog of stuff that they've made, because I have too much crap on my plate. But anyways, so I knew that in general it had these, the species, the Genii, who are androgynous and don't have gender. They used to, but they have evolved beyond that, both physically and societally, to the point that having a sense of gender within their society is considered a sickness and perverse. Now, this is interesting in a number of ways, and one of the most bizarre things about it is, as you're watching it, you realize that despite setting up a gender identity story very flatly, like that's what they're dealing with, the character at the center of this who bonds with Riker, their name is Soren, actually her. I'm going to say her name because she does have a sense of herself as a woman. That's something that causes a lot of issues within the story. But she has this attraction to Riker, and it's the attraction that gets focused on, despite the fact that, flat out, she has a gender identity, which is something she's not even supposed to have. So, this is, by its nature, a trans narrative. By its nature, it is a gender identity narrative, but it's not structured to be one. It's one kind of by accident. They seem to very much want to be making a statement about the acceptance of homosexuality, because ultimately where the focus both for Soren, for Riker, and also for the rest of the Genii and where they take issue with is all around the idea of her desires. And the story's really only interested in Soren's identity as a woman insofar as that's how they justify her attraction to Riker. So it's actually, despite being very much analog to homosexuality, I'll explain some of the reasons why that is in a minute. It is actually incredibly heteronormative because it's based on the assumption of, well, if her sense of self is female, she's going to be attracted to someone like Riker and his magnificent beard, his affectation on his face. But the reason that I say that it is, I do believe this really firmly, and Jessie has said as much, and I expect she's done more research into this directly than I have, but even not doing a ton of research into the intention, the way it's built is there are all these comparisons to how the desires are a sickness. Not the identity, but the desire is a sickness. The attraction. There are these comparisons, these parallels to conversion therapy. And with all the focus being not necessarily on her identity, but the attraction that results from it, it is very clear that this is very much designed to play off of how anything other than heterosexual sexual orientations are treated within society, especially at the time it was made, which would have been in the 90s. And yet, they accidentally used gender identity to talk about homosexuality. And they used a heterosexual attraction to talk about homosexuality. Like, this episode is really well-meaning, and I don't even think it's particularly off or problematic, really, in its execution. It means really well. It has a good understanding of just that people have a sense of themselves from a very early age. This is their normal. They feel that there is nothing wrong with them, but society is telling them that something is wrong with them. And the extent to which society is prepared to exert its force to force these people to be normal is frightening. And all that is, really well done. But it's muddy as hell because it was clearly made without consideration to what they were using to try and tell this, which brings in a whole bunch of other baggage. And that's not to say that there isn't equivalents of conversion therapy and things like that for gender identities. There is. But that wasn't something that was at the forefront at the time this was done. Homosexuality and attempts to pray the gay away and equivalents of that was at the forefront of conversations at the time this was made. So again, I feel very comfortable saying that was what they were trying to talk about, even though they roped in all this other stuff. And it results in a well-meaning, pretty well acted, decently executed muddle. It is so strange watching them use gender identity to talk about homosexuality while demonstrating it through a heterosexual attraction. It's, again, everything is coherent in terms of intent and message, that being people are who they are and that's fine, don't try and force a change on them. And so, thankfully, that's consistent across any interpretation of this. But the pieces used to do this are very weird. And I think it's also very telling that this didn't have the guts to just have it be a story about homosexuality, and horror of horrors, maybe Riker would have been attracted to Soren if Soren's identity leaning had been male, or they had just flat out ditched the androgyny and Soren had just been a guy. And Riker found himself attracted. I mean, they were never going to do that. In the 90s, absolutely not. Not a chance in hell. But it certainly would have been much cleaner. And it simply could have been one of those cases of just really critiquing the society of this race that they've encountered without bringing in the idea of androgyny and genders and having her actually be straight while trying to use it to talk about homosexuality. There's no reason why they couldn't just have it be a homosexual attraction that Riker is amenable to, because the Federation is more enlightened and it's a society that doesn't look down on that, whereas the Janai do. And that conflict would have been enough to just take it head on, but Star Trek wasn't prepared to go that place in the 90s. They weren't ready to just do it. So the analog and the metaphor that they came up with, it just makes it weird. It does. Oh, I do feel they need to set... They oversell Riker's attraction, at least... Like, I get that he's attracted, he's connecting, he cares about, and is prepared to go to lengths to try and help Soren. But when he says the words, "I love you," I'm like, dude, like, you don't have to be in love with someone to care about them enough to rescue them from a situation you think is dangerous. Like, you do not know her that well. I don't buy that. So, I do like that the nature of her being physically androgynous doesn't really appear to be a hang-up for Riker. I do appreciate that. That's nicely done. I feel a little bit bad for Worf. Worf drew the short straw on the obligatory, well, somebody has to say something, with bigoted gender views in this episode, and unfortunately Worf got stuck with that. Although he kind of gets redeemed on it because he goes to help Riker try and help Soren at the end. And he even gets to, properly beat people in a fight. So we don't have the Worf effect where he's always getting beaten up to prove how dangerous somebody else is. So, that was kind of nice. And the ending has a proper sense of weight and sadness and tragedy to it. So, for what it is, I think it's well done. I think especially looking at it through the lens of definitely and society in general, but certainly my own personal understanding of gender versus sexuality and all this other stuff, it is a muddled mess, but it's a muddled mess that means so well, I can't bash on it too much. They tried, and their heart was in the right place, and I don't think they completely dropped the ball. They just didn't realize what else they were getting themselves into with the way they went about it. So that's Quality of Life and The Outcast. What do you think about these episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. If you want to commission me to review stuff, you can do so through my Patreon. And any amount of support you're able to give me there is a massive help. But even if you can't do that, the like, share, subscribe help me out. But don't sweat that too much either. Take a relaxed attitude around here, so just come on back next time you need a break.